Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
Hello, Old Sports, and welcome back to the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. And we are glad to have you join us this week as we discuss the starting five, the all-time starting five for each franchise in NBA history. We will do the Eastern Conference this week and then the Western Conference at some point over the next couple of weeks around some of the other basketball-themed episodes that we have planned for you. I'm Dan Neumann, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Andrew Neumann. Andrew, how are you doing this evening?
Doing well, Dan. I know you're still down in Florida, but we had a nice day today where it was it was like over 50 degrees today in the area in New York here, melted a lot of the snow that we've been getting the last 2 weeks or so pretty consistently. And it's always nice when you get that first day of warm weather, although again, 48 or 50 degrees isn't necessarily warm, but for the late February, it's a nice change from what we've been getting. And I always talk about, it's kind of the reverse of, I love the fall, but sometimes in late October, you'll have a day where you go out into the, in the morning, and instead of getting like the normal sort of crisp air of the fall, you get that sting of like, oh yeah, winter's coming. This is kind of that, where I went outside this morning and I had my winter coat on because I leave for work pretty early, but I was like, oh, it's not like biting through my bones. So, and that was, so it was a nice day. Long way of saying I'm doing all right.
Glad to hear it. And as you mentioned, my lovely wife and trivia host, Allison, she and I are in Florida for another 10 days, I guess. It's Wednesday and we leave next Saturday. So we're enjoying the warm weather. Have the next 2 days off of work. Well, technically, like I said, we're recording this on a Wednesday night. So I have the next 4 days off of work. And it's been nice to be enjoying some of the warm weather. Before we get started, I would just like to remind you all to please follow the show, subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or whatever your podcast app of choice is. Please also like us, rate us, give us a review. Find us on Facebook at Hello Old Sports Podcast, and also you can email us at hellooldsports@gmail.com. I'd also like to note that we have been guests on a number of our sister podcasts here on the Sports History Network. All of these have been posted by this point. Andrew and I appeared on Jeremy McFarland's Football is Family, talking about our fandom of the New York Giants. We also appeared with Os Davis on the SHN, the Sports History Network Showcase, talking about our podcast and sort of how we got into it and some of our interests in sports. And then I appeared last week on Darren Hayes on his Pigskin Dispatch podcast talking about the greatest NFL players ever to wear the number 4. So check all 3 of those out whenever you have the chance. So this week it is all.
Before we get into next week, you also said please like us on iTunes or whatever. Just please like us. I don't have very much self-esteem, so it would be nice if you just could like us, because we're trying hard, and it's we work at this, and so just if you could like us or just keep your dislike to yourself, that would be nice too.
We've gotten very little hate mail so far, so that's been good at least. So we want to talk. This is going to be very similar to an episode we did about a month to a month and a half ago, where we did the Mount Rushmore of quarterbacks for each of the 32 teams in the NFL. What we're looking at this week is all-time starting fives for the 15 NBA teams in the Eastern Conference. Unlike the teams that we put together, unlike the Mount Rushmores that we put together for the NFL, the quarterback episode, these teams, at least in theory, would be taking the court together. So we are designing a starting five, but it would be guards, forward, center. We didn't just pick, 5 guys at the same position.
We didn't just pick the 5 best players in franchise history.
Exactly. In some cases, it's that way. In quite a few other cases, it's not. So the theory is that this team would at least, in a hypothetical historical world, this starting 5 would take the floor. So we purposely left it a little bit open, just like we've done with some of our other episodes. I kind of sent the theme to Andrew, and then we prepared independently of each other. So we may have sort of not exactly followed the exact same guidelines, but that's part of what makes it so fun.
Yeah, and I'll give you sort of my general rule, although pretty quickly I'll get into at least one that I broke that rule on. But in general, I tried to go with 2 guards, 2 forwards, and a center. I didn't go crazy. For the most part, I tried to go point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, but those are also newer distinctions, especially when you talk about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. Those weren't as solid a distinction. But I did, I was looking at ESPN did a similar one of these a few years ago, and a lot of time, all of a sudden they'd be like, we put 4 guards on this team. I tried to avoid that. And what I also tried to avoid, although like I said, I broke this rule once or twice, a lot of times you'll see when places do this with all-time teams, they just take an older center and make them a power forward. In general, if the guy was a pure center his whole career, regardless of whether these days he would be a center or not, I forced him to be a center. And there's one team where that's really tough that we'll get into next week because they had 4 really of the greatest centers of all time, and you cannot dress any one of them up as a power forward. I'm talking about the Lakers, obviously. But I also will admit that I broke that rule once or twice. So that was sort of my guideline, but I didn't do anything where, to be honest, it would be a cop-out to say, oh, well, with this team, I'll put a guard and 4 forwards there because that's the easiest. Then you're basically just doing the 5 greatest players on the team.
And it's funny because both the very early days and the very recent days give you a little bit more wiggle room, because in the early days, you just had guards, forwards, and center. The distinction between a point guard and a shooting guard and a small forward and a power forward. So, for instance, the 70 Knicks or the 73 Knicks, it was Clyde and Barnett or Clyde and Earl Monroe. They didn't really have that point guard, shooting guard distinction. And then over the last, I don't know, whatever you want to say, 10, 15 years, everybody is some sort of a slash. They're either a guard forward or they're a forward center or they're at least a small forward, power forward. You got the stretch 4 and all of these things. So it's funny how during that middle chunk of the 75 years in the NBA, the positions were much more defined. But on either end, on the early days and right now, it's a lot more fluid. So did you have anything else to add before we got started?
No, just the only other thing, sort of like we did with the football, we're doing franchise histories. So, the Philadelphia 76ers are also going to be going back to the Syracuse Nationals, and the Oklahoma City Thunder are also going to be going back to the Seattle Sonics, although that one was tempting to split them out. The ESPN one I saw did split them out. But, so that's the one where that's going to really come into again in the West is the Sacramento Kings, when you're really talking a lot about the Cincinnati Royals from the early part of the century or 50, 60 years ago. So that's kind of where we're at with those as sort of the officially recognized franchise histories.
And unfortunately for those who listened to our episode on the early days of the NBA, we only are going with current NBA franchises. So we did not select an all-time starting 5 for the good years or the Red Man tobaccos. So
and also one last thing, and this is probably goes against type a little for me, but for the 4 teams, I did factor in the ABA a little bit.
Absolutely. Me too.
Okay. All right. So why don't we start? And I think what we should do is with the conferences with the NFL, we did a winner of each division. I think that maybe we just do for each conference, we just maybe do a top 2 and then a winner
for the conference.
Okay. Yeah, I organized these by divisions, but
So did I.
Divisions in the NBA are basically meaningless at this point. So, yeah, I think that's probably the best way to do it, is to sort of just go top 2, and that way we'll have 4 when we're done with both episodes, and then we can go from there.
All right. Why don't we start in the Atlantic, and why don't we start with our beloved New York Knicks?
Okay. Do you want me to go first?
Why don't we go back and forth? So why don't you start for this one? Give me your all-time starting 5, and then for the next one, I'll give you mine, and we'll go back and forth like that. Okay.
So for the Knicks, I went with Clyde, Walt Clyde Frazier, no-brainer to me. I went with Earl Monroe. Only real knock would be wasn't a Knick as long, but he's a Hall of Famer. He played most of his career with the Knicks when you look at it. I went with him. I went with Carmelo Anthony as the small forward. And then, like I said, I did break my rule a little bit here, and I went with Willis Reed as the power forward and Patrick Ewing as the center. So that's my 5.
I was with you on 3.
So I'm guessing you don't have either forward.
No, I do. I have Clyde. I have Carmelo.
Oh, okay.
It pained me to put Carmelo on there because his tenure with the Knicks was just basically, with the exception of one season, it was just you were frustrated with him, you were frustrated with the team. I was not sorry to see Carmelo go when he left, but he won 3 scoring titles, I think.
I don't know if it was 3. He definitely won the 1. I don't know if it was 3.
Maybe he didn't win as many as I thought he did, but the thing is, there's not really another good small forward in Knicks history. Bernard King for like a year, but really it's really just Carmelo, and I'm just looking now to see how many scoring titles he had. No, you're right. He only won the 1 scoring title in 12-13,
which was a really good year.
Which was the year that they went to the playoffs. They won 50 games, 52 games, whatever they won that year. So yeah, you got to go Carmelo. I went with Ewing. My power forward was Dave DeBusschere. Now, Willis is a better player than DeBusschere, but I felt like they were close enough. And with power forward being DeBusschere's natural position, that was what kind of gave him the edge in my book.
And what was I have a feeling I know where you're going, but who was the second guard?
Where do you think I'm going?
I think you're going really old school.
With?
I always get these guys confused. What was it, McGuire?
I went with Carl Braun. Carl Braun, who was not elected into the Hall of Fame until about 10 years ago, but he was a 5-time All-Star with the Knicks. He was on the team during, and it's funny actually, though, now that I look at it, he actually was in the military for a couple of their NBA Finals years, but he was on the team that made it to the finals in 53 against Minneapolis. Monroe, I don't know. I sometimes feel like Earl Monroe's Knicks career is somewhat overrated. He was there for the championship year, the second championship year in 73, but after that, he was hurt a lot the following year, and then he didn't do a whole heck of a lot. He was a good player, but the team was not very good, so I don't know.
Yeah, I got to push back on that. He didn't do a whole heck of a lot. He averaged over 20 points a game. He was an all-star 2 more times. He played after that. The next year he was hurt, but after that he played 77, 76, 76, 64, and then his last year he only played 51 games, but that was in 1980. I mean, he played. It was not like his career was winding down there. He was a Hall of Famer based on what he did with the Knicks.
Yeah, that's
people
fair.
like to point out, what he did with the Bullets. He was a Bullet for 4 years? Yeah, I'm not going to count the 3 games in 71, 72. He was a Bullet for 4 years. And then he had a Hall of Fame career with the Knicks. The Bullet stuff doesn't hurt, but.
All right, here's what I propose. Why don't we we take the classic Nick backcourt of Frazier and Monroe, but then why don't we also go to Busher, because I think it's close, but the fact that Busher is a true power forward and Reed is not.
That's fair.
All right. So Clyde Frazier, Earl Monroe, Carmelo Anthony, Dave DeBusschere, and Patrick Ewing. You want to stick in the New York area and go with the Brooklyn Nets?
Yeah, sure.
So my starting five for the Nets: Jason Kidd, Kerry Kittles, Julius the Dr. Irving, Buck Williams, and Brooke Lopez at center.
You got 4 out of 5 correct. Kidd is obviously a no-brainer. Julius the Dr. Irving, and I almost tripped that up because these days I say Julius the Dr. Randall all the time. Buck Williams and Brooke Lopez, but Vince Carter over Kerry Kittles is, I know Vince Carter played a million places, but Vince Carter with the Nets was there. Let's see how long Vince Carter was there with the Nets. He was there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seasons. He was an all-star for 3 of them. Was the starting shooting guard almost pretty much the whole time he was there. To me, he was better. Those averaged his all of his years with the Nets. He averaged over 20 points a game, over 25 a couple of times. To me, Vince Carter was better every one of those years than Kerry Kittles was at any point.
And they were playoff teams those first couple of years with Carter. They lost in the first round in 2005, but then 2006 and 2007 they won a playoff series. They were not what you might call a contender, but they were a very good team, at least in the context of the Eastern Conference. So I think I had gotten Kittles because he was there for so long, and you're right, Carter's tenure with the team tends to feel almost like a blip, given all the places he's been since. But I think you've convinced me there. So Jason Kidd, Julius Irving, Buck Williams, Brooke Lopez, and Vince Carter.
Yeah, it's you realize how good Lopez was for a while when you look at that. And what I kind of did is I made my list, and then I would look at the ESPN thing just to make sure I wasn't really showing my behind with some of my picks, to make sure I was sort of in the ballpark, and they had Vince Carter in there too. So,
all right, where do you want to go next?
Should we go up north real quick and go to Toronto?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
All right, so for Toronto, I have, and again, we're only going back to 1995, and a lot of this history is not much to speak of. I went with Lowry, DeMar DeRozan, Vince Carter again as a small forward with them, Kawhi Leonard, and Chris Bosh. And I know Leonard was only there a year, but if you're going to, A, it's a team that has not been around for very long, and B, if you're going to talk about a guy who was only there 1 year, he certainly made his impact felt. So
you moved Bosh over to center.
Yeah, he's listed as both for those.
I went with Valanciunas. He was also on, or he actually wasn't on the championship team. He got traded midway through the season. I believe, was that the Marc Gasol trade, I want to say, mid-season? Let me take a look at that here. I think that was yeah, he was traded to the Grizzlies in February of 19, the championship year, for Marc Gasol. Kawhi was tough for me since he was only on the team 1 year. I don't know. This is the only 1 year thing hangs me up, even though the team's only been there for about, 25, 26 years. On the other hand, the fact that they finally won when they traded away Valanciunas sort of maybe pushes me to, the more I think about it, I think I was also I was having a hard time thinking of Bosh as a traditional center. He's much more of a power forward in my mind.
I kind of went with what Basketball Reference listed for.
I did a lot of that too, but at least with Bosh, I remember his whole career, and I just remember him as less of a center and more of a power forward. It's like on those.
They have him listed as a center almost every year he was on Toronto.
Yeah, and I guess even on those Miami teams, he was sort of the center.
They have it half and half with him with Miami, but like we said, a different, much different era and things like that. So there's no disagreement on the first three, right? We were just talking about the 4 and the 5.
Yeah, and we don't disagree on Bosch. It's just a question of Kawhi versus Valanciunas.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Valanciunas never made an all-star team. And so not that means all that much, but, never made an all-star team, never made an all-NBA team. An okay player, but yeah, to me it was more about whether I could consider Bosch a center or not, and whether or not I could put a guy there that was only on the team for 1 year. But
yeah, I understand. That's, it's not something with him and with a franchise that, really how much history between 95 and 05 outside of Vince Carter, what did they have? I mean, they were all right, but more accurately between 2002 and 2012, what did they have? So, with a franchise with more history, yeah, 1 year wouldn't fly, but.
And you know what? Let me go with the guy who won a championship versus the guy who needed to be traded away to win a championship. So I'll go with you. So we got Kyle Lowry, DeMar DeRozan, Vince Carter, Kawhi Leonard, and Chris Bosh.
So Vince Carter has been on 2 of the 3 teams we've talked about already.
And so now we've got either Boston or Philly. Where do you want me to go?
Let's go with Boston, just because I feel like that might be a little more. It's obviously a loaded team, but it might be a little more straightforward.
Yeah, this one was a little tough for me. Bob Cousy, John Havlicek, Paul Pierce, Larry Bird, and Bill Russell.
So we agree on 4. Cousy, Havlicek, Russell, and Bird. I went with McHale over Pierce. I know Paul Pierce had a phenomenal career. There's no denying that, because if anybody could deny it, I would deny it. You could certainly make the case for him over McHale. I just didn't.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Pierce didn't really, he led those. It's so hard because it's different eras. I always talk about this, how, when, this is a little bit of a digression, but when LeBron and Wade and Bosh teamed up, I remember a lot of people saying, guys from like the 90s and the 80s saying, well, that never would have happened in my day. We would have tried to beat each other, blah, blah, blah. And I always say to myself, if there was a salary cap in the 80s, and if there was more free agency in the 80s, I can almost guarantee that James Worthy would have left the Lakers at some point to go be a star somewhere else and not the number 3 guy between Magic and Kareem. Yeah. There's a pretty good chance that McHale gets tired of being yelled at by Larry Bird all the time in, 1986 and goes and signs with, the Bulls or something. He's from the Midwest, whatever. So I think it's hard to say, and this is all to bring me to my point that, like, Pierce was the best player on a lot of teams that either stunk or in the early years with the Antoine Walker teams, could barely get out of the second round. McHale was the second best player on teams that won a bunch of championships. So, yeah, it's tough. I think I'm giving in a lot on this.
I'm not. I agree it's close.
But yeah, that's my point on this one, though. This is the one I was back and forth with a lot. Mm-hmm. So I was like, oh, McHale, and then I was like, oh no, Paul Pierce. And so I think in the context of sort of who the better Celtic was, and also in the context of theoretically we want this team to play together, and
yeah, I didn't put too much stock into that.
I didn't put a ton into it, but if you think about it, McHale's game here, if you have Bird, Pierce, and Havlicek, you've got 3 guys who have sort of similar type games. They're all sort of small forwards at heart. So, this is one, the last couple I kind of feel like you convinced me. This one I didn't really need much convincing on because I was in different places with it myself. So I think we can go with McHale.
Okay. So Kuzi, Havlicek, Bird, McHale, Russell.
Correct. Why don't we go to the great fighting city of Philadelphia?
Philadelphia 76ers. So I went with Allen Iverson, Hal Greer, Julius Erving, Charles Barkley, and Wilt Chamberlain.
Yeah, that was mine too. I'm ashamed to admit that when I did this the first time, I forgot about Wilt, and just before the show, I was looking and I was like, "Oh, I think I might have. Did I miss Wilt Chamberlain?" Yeah.
So who did you have listed there?
I had Dolph Schayes.
Oh, okay.
As the center, and I'd also thought about Moses, but as good as Moses was, he was only on the team for a few years. So it was really between. It does sort of pain me to leave off Dolph Schayes, and I know that sounds odd, but the guy, maybe other than Bob Pettit, was, the best power forward in the league for the first, couple of decades. He played a very long time. He started with the team back in 49. Most of his career is with the Syracuse Nationals before they became the Sixers. His last season was in Philly, and he won a championship with them. And Barkley's tenure in Philly was marred by a lot of both off the court controversy, but then also a lot of mediocrity once Moses and Dr. J and especially and Cheeks later on, and once all those guys were gone. So I was and sort of remain very on the fence between Barkley and Schayes, especially when you figure that Barkley's best year was in Phoenix once he was gone. Yeah,
the year after he left Philadelphia and he was actually motivated again. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is harder for me than I thought it would be.
While you're thinking about it, Chamberlain was only on the Sixers for 4 years, but when you look at those 4 years, he averaged 30, 33, 24, and 24, and that's points. And then in rebounds, he averaged 22, 24, 24, and 23, and led them to a championship in 67. So,
and for what it's worth, that 67 76ers team is considered one of the best single-season NBA teams of all time.
Ended the Celtics run.
They ended the Celtics run of, what was it, 9 finals appearances in a row, or no, 10 finals appearances in a row, and 9 championships. So, yeah.
8 in a row.
No, because they won 1, then they lost 1, then they won 8 in a row.
Won 8 in a row.
Yeah, but they'd been there 10 years in a row, and the Sixers beat them not in the...
Yeah, no, I know. But the way we're wording it, yeah, they won 8 in a row, they've been to 10 in a row, and they won 9 of those 10.
Since I've been so cooperative, can you give me Schayes over Barkley here?
Yeah, I think we can do that. Barkley's another one where, I think we devalue his career a little bit because of his public persona now, but, there is no doubting that the latter portion of his Sixers tenure was him being a bit of a
boob.
Yeah, grump, and, and then it took him leaving that next year in Phoenix for him to have the best year of his career,
So Hal Greer, Allen Iverson, Julius Erving, another guy who's on 2 teams in the Atlantic Division, Dolph Schayes, and the great Wilt Chamberlain. Why don't we move on to the Central Division, and why don't we start with the Detroit Pistons? And I believe it's my turn.
It is.
To go first here. So I'm going to go with Isaiah Thomas, Dave Bing, Grant Hill, Ben Wallace, and Bob Lanier.
Yeah, that's a 5 for 5 with me. The closest one was whether to go with Joe Dumars or Dave Bing. When you first pull up the Basketball Reference page and everything is Joe Dumars as the franchise leader in most stats, you're inclined to think about him, to put him in there, especially with his backcourt mate with Isaiah. But, you give a sort of go a level deeper and it just everything pointed to Dave Bing for me. This is a very diverse one in terms of era. I thought I would have more bad boy Pistons on there, but then, if you're not going to go with Dumars, there's really nobody else to go with. Grant Hill surprised me because you look at what Grant Hill did, and in your head, when you think of Grant Hill, to me at least, you go, yeah, great start to his career, was marred by injuries. Obviously a horrible sort of free agent, turned out to be a horrible free agent signing, but that was all after he left Detroit. If you look at his numbers with Detroit, he played almost every game. It was just immediately after. It was almost like Ken Griffey with Seattle. Now, obviously Ken Griffey Jr.'s run with the Mariners was much better than Grant Hill's with the Pistons, but really the injuries came later and pretty much exclusively later where he didn't, he had almost no seasons where he was playing like 20 games a year on average after that. But those 7 years or whatever with the Pistons playing in those horrendous teal uniforms, he was still on his way to a Hall of Fame career.
No, and there really are similarities with Griffey. Sort of burst on the scene, a lot of hype. Comes from a sports family. Grant Hill's father was it Calvin Hill, was a defensive back with the Cowboys in the 70s.
Was he a D-back?
He was a defensive back, yeah. Played a bunch of years and then left as a free agent, and then the team that signed him wishes they hadn't, and then kind of putters along. But 6 years, an all-star in 1, 2, 3, 4.
Calvin Hill was a running back, by the way.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, I thought that. Who am I thinking of then? Is that Grant Hill's father?
Yes.
I thought he was a defensive back.
No, he was a 4-time Pro Bowler, 69, 72, 73, 74. First Cowboy running back to have 1,000-yard rushing season. Yes, he was a running back.
I stand corrected. But Hill, and you're right. I mean, his rookie year, he only plays 70 games, then goes 80, 80, 81, 50, but that's the strike year. There's only 50 games in the season, and then 74. So, he was not. And then this I had forgotten about. The year he signed with Orlando, he only played 4 games. And then the following year, 14, and then 29. Then he was injured for the whole year. So in his first 4 seasons with the Magic, he only plays in 18 and 29. He only plays in 47 games. So he plays a little more than half a season in 4 years with the Magic. But, I think with Detroit, and you're right, I mean, I guess you could go really far back and you could go like to Ed Yardley from the 50s, but I felt like Hill did enough to, even though he didn't win anything, it felt like he did enough to make his way on the team.
Yeah. And Ben Wallace, obviously, I was glad to get a guy from those teams in there too. Not that I went looking for that, but Ben Wallace's rebounding numbers and in an era where, guys who weren't scorers is becoming, you rarely have guys. I know it was 20, like usually now you don't have guys who average a couple of points a game, but he was so good. And, he was sort of there on their way up. And then as they started assembling pieces, Chauncey Billups and Rasheed Wallace, he was still sort of the linchpin there with them.
And those couple years on the Pistons, he was like a Martian. He was like something in the league that was just unmatched. He was this big guy who was mostly a rebounder and a defensive player, but the only guy who'd been close was Rodman, but Rodman had been, Rodman had all the personal issues. Wallace, when he came on the scene, he got so much attention just because of what an oddity his game was. So, he definitely deserves to be on here, I think.
All right. So we got Detroit, and we were in agreement there. So we're in the Central Division here. We got Milwaukee, Indiana, Cleveland, Chicago. Do you have a preference for where we go here?
No, it's your turn, so why don't you choose it?
All right. Let's go with Cleveland. So for Cleveland, I went with Mark Price, Kyrie Irving, LeBron, Nance, and Doherty. So you get the 3 guys from those late 80s, early 90s teams, and then Kyrie Irving and LeBron.
Yeah, I can't argue too much with Kyrie. I did not have him. I had Hot Rod Williams from the 80s, who, as we found out in our interview with Mr. Nepper last week, was one of the highest paid players in the NBA. Strangely enough, in the late 1980s, early 1990s. I just want to see if Basketball Reference has his salary data. Yeah, he was making close to $4 million in the 90s. He went from $364,000 in 88-89 to $3.785 million in the following season, even though he never made an all-star team. And he they must have just been paying him that money based on potential, because really it was crazy in his career. He never really did all that much. I guess with Kyrie, I think what prevented me from taking Kyrie was less his tenure in Cleveland, and more just because I felt like the team would be kind of guard heavy with Price, LeBron, who's kind of a 2-3 anyway, and then Kyrie. But Kyrie, in his years in Cleveland, he made 1, 2, 3, 4 all-star teams. He won the championship, and he had a damn good finals, if I'm remembering correctly.
Franchise history.
Say again?
He hit the biggest shot in franchise history in Game 7.
Yeah.
And you also got to think about those 3 years. He comes in, a year after LeBron leaves, as a 19-year-old rookie on, those first couple of years they're on bad teams, and he averages 18, then 22, then 20, around 6 assists. Again, you have to sort of separate the end of the run in Cleveland where he began a piece of performance art that he's still carrying on to this day. But, went from being sort of the young up-and-coming linchpin of the team to then being a role player to, not a role player, but a supporting cast to LeBron, and then even to a lesser extent, Kevin Love, and won a championship. Like I said, hit the biggest shot in franchise history in Game 7. To me, that was why I was able to sort of, and he was the last one I slotted in there too, but, he was an all-star for the 6 years he was there, so that's why I went with him.
Yeah, I think you're right, and you can always put him at point guard and move Mark Price over to shooting guard.
That was the only thing, was I was like, they're both kind of point guards, and that was one of the ones where I was like, I'm not going to split hairs here. I'm going to go with both of them.
And as good as Mark Price could shoot, if he was in the league today, he'd be a shooting guard. He'd be one of these guys who just hung out at the three-point line and knocked down threes while they doubled LeBron. So, yeah, Kyrie Irving, Mark Price, LeBron James, Larry Nance, and Brad Daugherty. So you got the big three from the late 80s teams that were pretty good, and then you got the two guys from the team that finally broke through and won a championship.
No real debate on anybody else, right? I mean, obviously not LeBron, but no real debate on the other three of them.
No, it's a young franchise. Yeah, I mean, I guess if you had to pick a sixth man, that might be where you threw Kevin Love in. But yeah, really, there's not much. There's not much there.
And truthfully, this is a weird distinction to make, but LeBron would be on there. If LeBron's two eras were split, LeBron would be on there twice.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And he'll come up again in a little while. So,
all right, let's talk about the Chicago Bulls. I went Derrick Rose, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant, and Artis Gilmore.
So we're off on, you and I agree on 4 of the 5. I went with B.J. Armstrong.
Instead of Rose?
No.
Instead of who?
As the other guard. I went with Rose, Jordan, Pippen, and Artis Gilmore as well. Rose, got to remember, Rose won an MVP with them. Was really good for them for a number of years. I know you can't really factor in what could have happened, but certainly was on his way to quite the career. And it may still in the league, and still actually honestly looks good with the Knicks right now, but that knee injury was just a catastrophic thing.
And he is likely to be the only MVP in NBA history who doesn't make it to the Hall of Fame. Now, the Pro Basketball Hall of Fame sometimes is not worth 10 cents, but there's at least a decent chance that Derrick Rose will be the first NBA MVP who doesn't make it into the Hall of Fame. So really a disappointing career, but what he did with the Bulls was enough.
And just Artis Gilmore, just to touch on him, was on the Bulls, started in the ABA, after was with Kentucky, then went to the Bulls, was there 76, was his first year with them at 27 years old, was there through 81, 82, was an all-star more often than not. I went with Rodman over Horace Grant, and I acknowledge that the issue with having Rodman on the team is he was only there for 3 years, whereas Horace Grant was there longer. They both won the same number of championships, and certainly playing – it's hard to argue, well, would they have won the same number of championships without either of them? Because, frankly, we don't know if the answer is yes or not. We don't know how little he would have been able to win a championship with those teams. But just to me, Rodman, again, was there 3 years, was obviously in his mid-30s at that point. So, the best years of his career were behind him. And certainly he didn't do himself any favors, but rebounding 15, 16, 15, which is what that team needed. They didn't need another guy trying to take shots. Certainly when you talk about all the playoff series down the line, you're going to need a guy who can.
He guarded Karl Malone in the finals.
Yeah. So I acknowledge that it's arguable because he only had 3 years and you can make a stronger case for Horace Grant. You know what I mean? It was close.
Andrew is perhaps the one sports fan or the one NBA fan that I know who did not, about a year ago, did not watch a single minute of The Last Dance, the Jordan documentary on ESPN.
I can elaborate on a part of that, and I'll do it quickly. Part of it was just that, yeah, I hated those Bulls teams. I still don't like most of the guys involved in it. In addition to being a Knicks fan growing up, I also, we've talked about this before, like the little brother thing with video games or whatever, where you would be the Knicks, so I'd have to find another team. In the early 90s, that 1 year, probably the first year I really remember basketball, I loved Charles Barkley. It was his first year with the Suns, and I liked that team, and they lost in the finals. And then in the late 90s, I really liked the Jazz.
Mm-hmm.
I liked their uniforms, which they promptly changed after I started rooting for them. I really liked John Stockton. I liked Karl Malone. I would beat them in a bunch of video games. And he beat them, too, in addition to what he did to the Knicks. So that's sort of the superficial thing. The additional level to it, and we can obviously, this is not the forum for it. I get a little frustrated when the fact that Michael Jordan was basically a sociopath gets celebrated as this is how you should compete.
Yeah.
Going into a training room and throwing his teammate on the ground as his teammate was sitting on the trainer's table and, verbally, like, there's a little too much celebration of that, and it's had a deleterious effect on our sporting culture where a lot of upper-level athletes think that's how they need to behave.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that maybe there was, the Birds and the Magics, Bird especially had a little bit of that beforehand.
Bird gets a little bit of a pass because he was white, but I don't know. I could do without every upper echelon athlete these days, and this includes Derek Jeter, who I loved. I could do without them all trying to do their stoic Michael Jordan impression.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point.
But I'm also not going to pretend it wasn't because the main reason was just because I don't want to relive painful childhood trauma.
One point I would make is that the reason I brought this up was because if you look at it, Rodman was basically checked out of that 97-98 season. So you can argue that not only did he only play 3 seasons, but that he was sort of not around much for the third. But
I wouldn't fight hard for Rodman. I understand the point for Grant.
Yeah, why don't we go with Grant just because Rodman was such a distraction in that last year, and Grant did make an all-star team. He was there longer, so we'll go Grant if that's all right with you. So that'll be Derrick Rose, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant, and Artis Gilmore.
Works for me.
Your turn. You got 2 to choose from.
So we're down to 2 more in this division. We're down to Indiana and Milwaukee. I'm going to go with Indiana, and I'm going to give you Mark Jackson, Reggie Miller, Paul George, George McGinnis, and Jermaine O'Neal.
Wow.
Very
Say those again.
I'm going to go with Mark Jackson, Reggie Miller, Paul George, George McGinnis, and Jermaine O'Neal.
We had one in common.
Reggie, I'm guessing?
Yes.
He
So
was the last one.
So let's start with point guard. You said Mark Jackson, correct?
Yes.
And what you're going to notice is that I'm very sort of ABA heavy here. I went with Freddie Lewis, who was the point guard on the Pacers in the 60s and early 70s when they were in the ABA, 3-time All-Star, 3-time ABA champion with the Pacers. The golden age of the Pacers was very much that 60s and early 70s ABA team. So to me, what he did with them he was named to the ABA all-time team in 97. To me, what he did with the Pacers far outweighs anything that Mark Jackson did.
Now, let me ask you this, and I mean this sincerely. Are you deducting it all for the fact that it was the ABA? I understand Dr. J, George Gervin, who we're going to get to, but it was still the ABA. Do you deduct it all for that, or is it's the same level?
I don't consider it the same level. I do deduct, but the Pacers have just, other than that couple of years, I guess the whole Reggie years, they were decent, but the Pacers have just not been very good, and they were so good in the ABA that I feel like, yeah, do I deduct for it? Yeah, but the deduction was not enough to take some of these guys off.
All right. Yeah, and I mean, the ESPN one has Lewis. The ESPN one's going to mirror what yours is. I won't fight for Mark Jackson. There might be ones I do fight for, but I won't fight for Mark Jackson.
Who was your small forward?
I went with Paul George.
So I had Roger Brown, who was another star of those ABA team. Now, Roger Brown is in the Hall of Fame. He played his whole career in the ABA, but he's actually in the Hall of Fame. 3-time All-ABA, 3-time ABA champ, obviously, 4-time All-Star. I went with him over Paul George. Paul George had some good years, but he also didn't play his whole career with the Pacers, obviously.
I would put a 4-time ABA All-Star in over a 4-time NBA All-Star.
How many times he was a 4-time All-Star?
7-time All-Star. He's a 6-time All-Star. He was a 4-time All-Star with the Pacers. And one of those years he missed, he only played in 6 games in 2014, 2015, because he had that gruesome leg injury with USA Basketball when he hit the stanchion behind the basket in one of the things you'll ever want to see.
Yeah, I mean, George has also made the all-defensive team. I don't know if they had that even when they were in the ABA, but yeah,
defense. Like I said, I'm not going to fight you on all these because I don't feel strong. Well, I mean, I have McGinnis, which I'm sure is where you're going next. To me, Paul George is better.
Yeah, I can say that. All right, I'll give you Paul George over Roger Brown. So your next forward was who?
I had George McGinnis.
I actually had Dale Davis.
Oh, really?
But I think that maybe now McGinnis, he won 2 championships with them. Yeah.
I went old school with you. Didn't?
Yeah, no, I don't know. McGinnis might have been an oversight on my part, frankly, probably because he only played the last 4 years with them in the ABA. But yeah, all right, I'll go with McGinnis. So we got Lewis, Miller, Paul George, McGinnis, and then who was your center?
I went with Jermaine O'Neal. I like the way Jermaine O'Neal played basketball, especially that one night.
When he jumped to the stands?
That means how basketball is played. You start a riot. Set the game back for 20 years.
Yeah, this is another one where I went ABA. I went with Mel Daniels, who was an ABA All-Star 6 times with the Pacers, won the 3 titles, 5-time All-ABA, twice the MVP of the ABA. Now, I don't know. Let me take a look here and see if those years that he won the ABA MVP, if those were actually. So he won the MVP in 69 and 71. Was he on the Pacers both those years? I think he was. Yeah, 2 ABA MVPs. I don't know. Jermaine O'Neal. Did Jermaine O'Neal ever even make an All-Star team?
He made 6 of them in a row as a Pacer.
Did he really?
Yes.
Geez, I'm way off.
He was this, but now here's where I'm going to concede the point. But All-NBA second team once, All-NBA third team twice. So he was never an All-NBA first team player when you're talking about a guy who was a 2-time MVP with the Pacers. All that other stuff is when he was in high school, the other career highlights. So, I'm willing to concede on that, but don't. Jermaine O'Neal was a perennial all-star for the Indiana Pacers and they were a contender all those years. But I will agree with you that I'm willing to concede on him, but I just figured I'd put in a word for him, even though he was probably not a guy before that he was on the Trailblazers when they were the Jailblazers. So.
Yeah, and I think this is the wrongest I've been on any point since we started doing this podcast. I had no idea Jermaine O'Neal made 5 All-Star teams, but
he made 6.
6 All-Star teams. I'm sorry. So let's go Freddie Lewis, Reggie Miller, Paul George, George McGinnis, and Mel Daniels. So we were respectful of the ABA, but we also made room for a couple of NBA guys, and
Miller, there's no debate about Miller.
No, there's no debate about Miller. None whatsoever. He's the best. Even with all the ABA titles and the MVPs, Miller is the best player in team history.
And he was there forever, too.
He really was. I mean, he was there from like the 80s, the Chuck Person years, all the way through to those teams with the brawl and everything, the Artest, Jermaine O'Neal, that whole team. He was just there forever. All right, so we're going to wrap up the Central. We're going to talk about the Milwaukee Bucks, and it's my turn. I went Oscar Robertson, Sidney Moncrief, Marcus Johnson, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
This whole thing was set up from the jump just so I wouldn't have to pronounce Giannis' last name. I still can't do it. So we agreed on 4 of 5. I went with Oscar. I went with Sidney Moncrief. I went with Giannis, and I went with Kareem. I don't think any of those 4, I guess maybe Moncrief. The other 3 you don't even have to think about. Who did you go with as a small forward?
The one thing I will say is I actually did have to think about Oscar because he only really played the last couple years of his of his career, but it's the only championship the team's ever won. They probably don't win it if Oscar doesn't come from Cincinnati and partner with Kareem. And
who else would it be? I know Gary Payton was there for a while, or not Gary Payton, Ray Allen was there for a while. They were both there, right? Weren't they traded for each other?
Yeah, I looked at Ray Allen probably. I probably would have moved. I don't know exactly how I would have done it, but it probably would have involved moving. I think the way I could have done it would have been Moncrief and Ray Allen would probably been the way I would have done it.
So who did you go with as a small forward again?
I went with Marcus Johnson, Marquess. He was really good on the teams of the 80s that were sort of perennial playoff teams but never got super far. The teams with Pressey and Moncrief and Terry Cummings, the Don Nelson coached Bucks. And so I went with him. He was an all-star with the Bucks 4 times, 3-time All-NBA. So, a decent player on a playoff team, a perennial all-star. And I couldn't find anybody else.
I went with Glenn Robinson. Glenn Robinson was there the better part of 10 years, made a couple of all-star teams, was never he was a all-rookie first team, but was never an all-NBA caliber player. But he is, I think based on where he is in sort of the franchise index in terms of points and things like that, that is why I had him up there. But I agree, it's not one that it's not a hill I'm going to die on. It's just, I think based on sort of the tenure he was there and sort of a perennial starter for the better part of 10 years with them, a couple of time All-Star, but nothing I'm going to, set my hair on fire over.
It's not an unfair point. I think I have to push a little hard for Johnson. Just more awards, more deep playoff runs, more All-Star games. So I think if it's all right with you, we'll go with Johnson.
That makes sense. So
Oscar Robertson, Sidney Moncrief, Marcus Johnson, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
And by the way, we spent a lot of time there on sort of the periphery, but I mean, Oscar Robertson, Giannis, and Kareem, a young Kareem is Giannis and a young Kareem. That's a pretty nice front court there. That's a really good point. Even with an aging Oscar, two guys who don't look like the same species, considering they're both great basketball players, but guys with a lot more finesse. Really, in between either of those guys, nobody at that position had that sort of finesse.
Absolutely. Agreed entirely.
So
we are now in the Southeast Division, and it's your turn. So why don't you pick
all right, and let me just clear up because this is going to get weird. Not weird, but so for Charlotte has the Hornets. The Charlotte's going to have the original Charlotte Hornets. Then when the Hornets moved to New Orleans, the New Orleans franchise in the West has the New Orleans Hornets, the New Orleans Pelicans, and then Charlotte has the original Hornets, the Charlotte Bobcats, and now once again the Charlotte Hornets. So just to sort of clear that up.
We ought to just can that because I think it's like the third time we've had to explain that. So we ought to just have that at the ready and just be able to insert it whenever we need to.
But it makes sense to explain here, doesn't it?
Absolutely. No question about it.
Well, you said can it. I thought you were saying like we're going to cut that out.
No.
So I guess
this the 1930s. Hey, can it.
Since I opened that door, I'll go with them, even though it's not one I'm particularly excited about, which is the Charlotte Hornets, which also includes their brief stint as the Bobcats. Kemba Walker, Del Curry, Gerald Wallace, Larry Johnson, and Alonzo Mourning.
You're 4 for 5 with me. I had Eddie Jones instead of Del Curry.
Okay. Let me pull up. Because I feel like go ahead.
I feel like Eddie Jones was more of sort of a team leader with the Hornets than hold on here. Yeah, no, I didn't do a very good job with this.
Didn't look hard enough at Del Curry. Is that what you're thinking?
I didn't look hard enough at Eddie Jones. He was only on a team for 2 years.
Where was he after that? Is it one where it was like weird?
He was Lakers, then the Hornets, then Miami. If you look at these two teams, and like I play a lot of NBA 2K, and they have the all-time rosters, and they do a pretty good job of it. There's so much crossover in the all-time teams between the Hornets and the Heat. It gets really confusing because you got Mourning, you got Eddie Jones, you got Glenn Rice. There's all this crossovers. And I think also I looked at who had been an all-star for the Hornets, and there aren't that many all-stars in Charlotte Hornet history, and Jones is one of them in the 2000 season. But I didn't realize that Jones had only played 2 seasons, one of which was the lockout year when he was traded mid-year and then played 30 games. So I didn't realize Jones only had 2 seasons with them. So
now Del Curry was there 10 years. It's ironically really didn't start for the most part, mainly came off the bench, but was there about 10 years. I think 10 seasons exactly. I believe starting with their original team in 88, 89. It was about a 15-point per game scorer.
Sixth man of the year in 94.
Yeah, what passed as a 3-point shooter back in the day. Certainly wouldn't lay claim to that, honor even in his family now. But, it's not a particularly deep franchise. Also, it's one that's only been around since 1988 and not continuously. So
yeah, they had a few years of a gap there. That's true.
And it's not like the Bobcats set the world on fire, although I do have Gerald Wallace there. So that was where I came with Curry. Was just, he was sort of my initial thought, and then I checked some of the other places, and they seemed to also have him on these lists. But
And those Hornets teams were decent, especially before Mourning left. Those teams were pretty good. That was the team that
playoffs a few times and
made the playoffs. They made the playoffs 93, 95, 97, 98. And that was a team in 93, I think it was. Yeah, 93, McHale's last year, the team that upset the Celtics in the first round in the 5-game series and knocked them out. And then McHale retired right afterwards. So, yeah, they were a good team. My only thing with Del Curry is I think I was a little resistant to him because I think people tend to talk about him as more of a legend now because of Stephen Curry.
Oh, so I agree with that. But when you look at it a little bit, you're like, yeah, he probably does, for lack of competition, belong on there.
Yeah, no, you're right. I was ignorant. That was a stupid mistake, Eddie Jones. So Kemba Walker, Del Curry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go finish the number and then.
Kemba Walker, Del Curry, Larry Johnson, Gerald Wallace, and Alonzo Mourning.
Real quick, which, by the way, would probably have problems in the locker room because Alonzo Mourning and Larry Johnson hate each other.
Yes, we talked about that some last week.
The Hornets would be a good episode to do that Hornets team because if you have to be at least my age, I think, to realize, like, they came onto the scene, and this was almost trivial, but, like, they really did change the way sports looked. Like, if you want a team that sort of defines the aesthetic of the 90s and created it, it's them. They came in late 80s. They ushered in the whole teal thing. Their merchandise was everywhere. Chances are, if you look at a picture of like a group of kids from the 90s of a, like a birthday party or something, somebody is wearing a Charlotte Hornets coat or sweatshirt or hat. The court was like a bee's nest, which nobody was doing any of that stuff before. In addition to Mourning and LJ, who was grandmama, you also had Muggsy Bogues, who, being 5'4", was always a big sort of media presence. And the other thing too, which is they were really the first pro team in the South that wasn't, if you take Florida out, like, they were the first team in the Carolinas, which now,
or Tennessee.
Yeah, what does Carolina have now? Carolina's got a football team, a basketball team, a hockey team. Tennessee has a football team, a basketball team, a hockey team. They're spread out across different cities.
And chances are, at some point, if baseball expands, that might be one of the places that they expand to, is that Carolina's Tennessee area.
Which was always, that was seen as like, well, those are college areas. So anyway, we can, but I was more thinking of it from like an aesthetics standpoint. I'm not saying it would be a real deep episode, but it's something worth sort of talking about, just how they were gone. They were one of the top, so they were one of the most popular teams, and they had like a couple of bad years, and suddenly they were gone.
And you're right about the teal thing. I mean, the Panthers, the Marlins, all these teams, any NHL teams came in with teal. So you're absolutely right about that. I also want to tell a little story that our guest from last week, Paul Nepper, in his Knicks of the 90s book, which I highly recommend. Apparently there was this story when Larry Johnson first came into the league. He signed with Converse, and they had this idea for a commercial where Larry Bird and Magic Johnson were in a lab, and they had just created the perfect basketball player, and they were arguing over what it should be called. And they were saying, Larry, no Johnson, Larry, no Johnson. And then he came up, and I think he showed up for the commercial, and one of the two guys had bailed, and they've never told him which one decided not to do it. My money's on Bird, but, yeah. They went with the grandmama thing instead. The funny thing too about Larry Johnson, again, to sort of combine this week's episode with last, he was this phenom with the Hornets, and then he went to the Knicks and he became like this old man, and not even in a bad way. He was a solid player for the Knicks on some really good teams. But if you had seen Larry Johnson playing for the Knicks in 99 or 2000, you would have never thought that 5 or 6 years earlier, he was this, billboard star, marketing, all the whole schmear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
All right. So you started with Charlotte. So I've got 4 to pick from here. I am going to go with the Miami Heat. And I'm going to say Tim Hardaway, Dwayne Wade, LeBron James, Udonis Haslem, and Alonzo Mourning.
And we're going to agree on this. This is another one where I I don't know how much you can argue about any of it. Wade,
You could try and put Bosch in there.
yeah, but I mean, Wade is the best player in franchise history. LeBron was there 4 years, won at least, 2 MVPs when he was there. They went to 4 straight finals. They won 2 titles. He was the best player in the league all 4 years he was there, whether he won MVPs or not. Hardaway, from a point guard standpoint, people forget just how good he was for how long.
Him joining the Heat is what kind of pushed them over the edge into being a real contender in the mid-90s.
Probably had his best years, definitely had his best years with Miami. And then Haslam, to me, is just based on longevity. He's, again, the leader in, I think, games played for them. He was there for a long time. So he gets the nod to me over Bosch, who, Bosch obviously was there to me, Bosch was there. He was the third guy for those teams, which, hey, being the third guy on those teams is no small shakes. Pretty quickly after LeBron left, he had the health issues, and so to me, I don't see putting Bosch in over any of the 3 front court guys. So
last year was such a strange year for sports with the virus and everything kind of happening at once. All the teams kind of came back at once, all the leagues, I should say, into their playoffs. So I don't remember exactly what the story was with Haslam, but this is his career. He joins the team the same year they draft Wade. So he's there for the 06 team that wins the title, the Shaq team. Then he's there, and then he's on the team for all the LeBron years. And then his last year with the team was last year. He didn't retire until the 2019-2020 season. Now, the last 4 seasons in reverse order, he's played 4 games, 10 games, 14 games, and 16 games. So it's odd to me that they would keep a guy around that long who was only going to play that number of games. Now, part of it's because he's been there for so long, but I'd have to look a little more and see. But you think about it, if they had won the championship last year, he would have technically been on championship teams with that, all 3 of their championship eras in the 15 or so years.
Oh, and by the way, I see a thing here from 3 weeks ago that he was cleared. He's still on the team.
Are you serious?
I see an article from January 30th that said Haslam Personal is available. He was cleared for Saturday's game against Sacramento. Veteran big man was considered questionable due to unspecified personal reasons. So I'm going to look up his stats for this year, but
he signed a contract with the Heat on November 28th, 2020. He has not played this year.
But he has. He's played 11 minutes, it appears.
Really? Maybe Basketball Reference hasn't updated his stats?
I have his stats from this year, but let's see. Yeah, it looks like he played against, was the 22nd a Saturday, or is that no, that was Monday. Maybe this is last year's, but the article makes it seem like maybe he hasn't played yet this year, but doesn't the article make it seem like he's on the team still?
I didn't see the article.
Oh, yeah, you didn't see. But anyway, we don't need to believe this. Whether he's still playing or not, it doesn't really change the fact, but yeah, I think he's listed on all these game logs. So maybe he just gets DNPs every night, or he's like,
maybe. So the Heat, Tim Hardaway, Dwayne Wade, LeBron James, Udonis Haslem, Alonzo Mourning. We have Orlando, Washington, and Atlanta. Why don't you choose one and tell me your guys?
So you said Orlando, Washington, and Atlanta, right?
Yes.
I will go with Orlando. And I went with Anthony Penny Hardaway, Nick Anderson, Tracy McGrady, Dwight Howard, and Shaquille O'Neal.
That's what I had too. Might have been the one team or maybe one of the couple where I was okay with going with just 2 traditional centers because. But
also, if they list him as a power forward a bunch of times.
Howard? Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't think of where else you would go with Orlando. So, yeah, to me, those kind of had to be the 5. I don't know. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I can't even think of who else there really was to consider. I kind of filled these 5 out pretty quickly.
Yeah, Penny Hardaway goes on there easily. Howard and Shaq, once you resolve the positional issues. McGrady, The only, I guess, if you the only one who automatically doesn't jump out is Nick Anderson, but then you look and you go like, oh yeah, he was a really good player for them, and certainly, who was the fifth starter on that team? Because it was Penny Hardaway, Nick Anderson, Grant, Shaq, and
I think it was future Nick Dennis Scott.
Okay, that sounds right. Yeah,
he was the 3, I think.
Yep. Yeah. I was just trying to remember.
Yeah, and then they had Donald Royal, and they had actually, so they just, Scott Skiles had left the team, I think, the year or two before.
Yeah, he was like their original
point guard.
The best player on the original bad Magic, like pre-Shaq.
And I think still has the single game assist record with 30 assists in a game. All right, we are down to the last 2 in this division and in this conference. Why don't I go with my adopted hometown, Washington Wizards? And I went John Wall, Bradley Beal, Gus Johnson, Elvin Hayes, and Wes Unseld.
I think that's correct. I had written in Pearl Monroe instead of Bradley Beal, but...
Didn't you just say you didn't want to hear about his Bullets career?
Not to denigrate his Knicks career.
Okay.
You're probably right on Beal, to be honest. But yeah, I had Wall, Johnson, Hayes, Unseld, no question about any of them, right?
Yeah, the only one I considered was I could try to put Phil Chenier in there somewhere, who's the other guy in addition to these 3, and Monroe, who has his number retired by the team. But he was just an all-star a couple times, was on the championship team, but doesn't really approach this level. So there were really kind of 4 guards: Wall, Beal, Earl the Pearl, and Chenier. Mm-hmm. Yeah, between Beal and Monroe, I'm kind of close, but you're right. Monroe's tenure with the Bullets was so short. Beal's going to be probably on the Wizards for a while now. Maybe they'll try and offload that contract like they did.
The Knicks want, or there's a lot of talk. A lot of people around here want him to get traded to the Knicks, but I don't know if I'm one of them.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm one of them either, to be honest with you, especially with that contract. But yeah, no.
By the way, Haslam is active tonight. He just has not played yet for the Heat.
Jeez. Well, by the time this airs in a week and a half or so, maybe Haslam will have gotten in yet another game. Yeah, I guess maybe just don't overthink it. Both of our original thoughts were Beal.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to go with Beal.
All right.
Again, it's one of those where reverse recency bias, where you're like, am I really talking about Earl the Pearl Monroe versus Bradley Beal? And then you go, well, when you're looking at in these confines, yes, you are.
Both made 2 all-star tems. Yeah, no, it's Beal.
Both are going to be traded from that franchise to the Knicks to be the final piece of a championship puzzle this year.
Yeah.
So that leaves us with the last team in the Eastern Conference, which is the Atlanta Hawks, which your initial reaction is to go, all right, Dominique, and then who else? And then you have to think and go, yeah, this goes back to the St. Louis Hawks, one of the earliest, sort of
really good teams.
I was going to say dynasty, probably not, but really good teams in the 50s in the NBA. So you got to kind of there's more of that in the West because so many teams in the West started, in the East. But was it my turn?
It's your turn.
All right. So here's what I went with Atlanta. I went with Cliff Hagan, Lou Hudson, Dominique Wilkins, Bob Pettit, and then I went with Dikembe Mutombo.
Mm-hmm. So I had you on 4. Dominique is a no-brainer. Bob Pettit is a no-brainer. And Bob Pettit, for people who don't realize, is one of the best, still to this day, one of the best, probably 3 or 4 power forwards in NBA history. He was the only guy who won an MVP in those early years who was not either Wilt, Russell, Cousy, or Oscar. He was like the one guy who wasn't a Laker or a Celtic, who I guess Wilt wasn't quite a Celtic yet, or wasn't quite Wilt wasn't quite a Laker yet. But people forget about Bob Pettit because it's so long ago, and he was eclipsed by so many of those guys who came later. But Bob Pettit, say again?
The team's not there anymore.
That's another good point. But Bob Pettit's probably still to this day, I would say, probably one of the best 20 to 25 players in NBA history. I had Cliff Hagan, who actually got his start with the Celtics and was traded to the Hawks along with another Hall of Famer, Ed McCauley, in the trade that brought Bill Russell to the to the Celtics. He had been drafted by St. Louis, and both those guys, both Hagan and Pettit, were leaders of the team that went all the way to the finals that first year and then won the championship against the Celtics the year before. It's interesting here. Cliff Hagan was drafted in 1953, but didn't play until his rookie year with St. Louis. So he was owned by the Celtics for like 3 years until he got traded. So I don't know what the
history. 53, you said?
Yeah, I'm looking at his basketball reference page. It said he was drafted in 1953, April of 53, but wasn't traded until 56. I'm curious.
Well, I was going to bring this up because he was still, in 1954, he was an All-American at Kentucky. Because I'm looking at the reason I pulled it up, the 54 All-American team, the forwards were Cliff Hagan from Kentucky, Bob Pettit from LSU, and then the National Player of the Year was the other forward, which was Tom Gola from LaSalle. So they must have drafted him before he was eligible to play.
Yeah, and that did happen in those years. I mean, the most famous one was Larry Bird, who was drafted by the Celtics and then still went and finished his career finished college with Indiana State. That was when they went to the NCAA finals that year. So it did happen. But I was with you on Hagan. I was with you on Neek. I was with you on Pettit. I was with you on Mutombo.
Oh, you were with Mutombo, huh?
Yeah, I was. I mean, I couldn't find another center, and I couldn't even find another. I guess Pettit could have kind of been a center, but I looked at some of the more recent guys. I looked at like Al Horford, but I just didn't. I kept coming back to the fact that some of Mutombo's best years were with Atlanta in the late 90s.
Exactly.
So I kept coming back to him. So I'm going to sort of preface this by saying I think you've convinced me with Hudson. He was on the team from 66.
I convinced you by saying his name?
No, well, you convinced me by bringing him up and then by me looking at him. My other guard for the Hawks was Pistol Pete. But he only really did 4 years with the Hawks. I mean, Pistol Pete, great college player at LSU. His NBA career leaves a lot to be desired. For a guy, he only won the one scoring title with the Jazz in New Orleans. 4 years with the Hawks, a couple of all-star teams. I don't know specifically, but I think Maravich, I know he never made the NCAA tournament. I think he made the playoffs, but I don't know if he ever even 5 playoff games in 70-71 with Atlanta, which to me feels like a first-round loss. So he never really did much as a team leader in the NBA. I know he was a great guy to watch and a great scorer, but
Hudson was there conversely for 11 years, actually started first couple of years with St. Louis, and then they moved to Atlanta, was an all-star, 6 straight years from 69 to 74 with the Atlanta Hawks, over 20 points a game, usually more like 25, 26 points a game. Certainly doesn't have the resonance that Pete Maravich does, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I'm with you in Atlanta, with Hudson on Atlanta. So Lou Hudson, Cliff Hagan, Dominique Wilkins, Bob Pettit, and Dikembe Mutombo. Before we wrap up, why don't we pick our 2 best Eastern Conference teams and then our Eastern Conference champion?
All right. Well,
I feel like Boston's got to be one of them.
I was just about to say, by default, it's Boston is number 1. Let me just look over this here. Don't think it's going to be anybody in that division. Is it Boston and Philadelphia?
I think it's Boston and Philly. 5 Hall of Famers. Wilt's an MVP. Iverson's an MVP. Dr. J's an MVP.
Yeah, it's got to be Boston and Philadelphia. It's the only argument you could make, honestly, is Chicago over Philadelphia because of just how good Jordan is.
I think you could make half a case for Milwaukee too, but you're right.
Fair. The only thing I would say about Milwaukee is that you got a guy who's still in the early phases of what's been an amazing career, and then 2 guys whose best years were not with Milwaukee.
I would argue that Kareem's best years might have been with Milwaukee, but
most of his career was with LA.
Fair. You're right. Johnson and Moncrief are not on the level of those other guys.
Like I said, Chicago, you could argue Chicago just on the strength of Jordan and Pippen, but not enough for that to fly, in my opinion.
All right, so it's Boston and Philly, and then I think, it's closer than you might think here. I would say Boston gets the nod.
Let's see. You got Wilt and Russell. Just for the sake of not arguing, let's call that a push. Bird, McHale, Dr. J, Schayes. It does have to be Boston.
If you consider the fact that Dr. J is only his Philly career, that to me, Bird's better than Dr. J probably when you take the full measure of each of their careers. But if you're just talking about Julius's Sixers career, it's definitely Bird.
And I guess you'd probably, not that we're doing this, but you'd probably say the weakest is Charlotte. Although, again, you're talking about newer franchises, so not to really pick, because there's some decent names on there, but the weakest would probably have to be Charlotte, right?
Yeah, there's nobody on that Charlotte team who goes to the Hall. Morning's in the Hall of Fame, but again, Basketball Hall of Fame, whatever. But yeah.
If he was wearing a hat, it would be a Heat hat.
If he was wearing a hat, I think it would be a Georgetown hat, given how the Basketball Hall of Fame does things.
Yeah, you know what I mean.
I do. All right, so that wraps it up. Celtics are the best, Philly's second, and the Hornets are probably the worst. Did you have anything else to add before we wrapped it up?
No, I don't know if I was surprised at the level of agreement. Really, the only one we were wildly different on was Indiana.
Yeah.
And again, that was mostly because of the ABA. And I probably did not do my full due diligence, although, like I said, I think we came to a consensus specifically on Paul George that he belongs on there. But yeah, I think for a lot of these we weren't super far off, and some of them, there's a lot of franchises have a lot more great players than you realize. Even franchises that don't seem to have too much history, or is their history really that great? And then you look and you're like, yeah, they had some damn good players. And then just sort of looking ahead to the West without getting into specifics. When we get into the West, there's again going to be some ones where like I was talking about with, you got a Golden State who this current era, but then they also go all the way back to when they were the Philadelphia Warriors. The Lakers, I think you can anticipate, will be quite a bit of discussion. Oklahoma City and the Seattle Sonics melding together. And then sort of on the other end of the spectrum, you have New Orleans, who only has their history and the New Orleans Hornets history, or Memphis. And you see some names that you're like, oh yeah, I think these guys would not be, when you're talking about, do you put, guys who were Hall of Famers, which one do you put in? And then for some of these you're looking and you're like, this guy was, he was the third team NBA one year. The range of guys you can discuss is interesting.
The Memphis Grizzlies have Greg Anthony on their NBA 2K all-time team. So that gives you an idea of what
he's not on my list. I'll admit that.
Absolutely. Mine neither. All right. Well, we hope you enjoyed this. And next week, it's the Western Conference. Until then, I'm Dan Neumann.
And I'm Andrew Neumann. Goodbye, old sports.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.